Chapter 7 of A Copper Harvest by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 Rocky Gulch and Neighborhood. It was a bright day 1 week from the stirring events just narrated. The scene is changed from the bustling little western town of Sackville to the wilds of the state of Montana. The exact spot was a point 3 miles southeast of a rough-and-ready mining settlement known as Rocky Gulch, and 7 miles as the crow flies from the town of Trinity on the north branch of the Cheyenne River. On one side was a rocky hill pierced at this particular locality by a rude opening, which might correctly be termed a cave, though it looked more like a hole in the wall of rock than anything else. On the other side was the head of a wide creek, to which the name of Beaver had been applied, and a narrow circuitous stream ran into it from its source somewhere in the hills beyond. 2 men, one of whom bore a strong likeness to Otis Clymer and the other to Dave Plunkett, were standing midway between the cave and the creek. "This must be the place," said the former, referring to a slip of paper he held in his hand. "Where's the mine?" asked Plunkett in a tone which showed he was not wholly pleased with the outlook. "That hole yonder must be the entrance to it," suggested Clymer. "If you think so, the sooner we look into it and find out whether it is or not, the better I'll be pleased. Before I plank up the dust, I want to know what I'm investing in." "That's all right," returned Clymer. "But you didn't expect to pick up a full-grown mine, all in working order, with machinery on the ground for a paltry $200 or $300, did you?" "I don't say that I did," asserted Plunkett. "But I ain't going to buy a hole in the ground without I've some idea what's behind it. If you can show me real copper in there, that'll be proof a man's story wasn't all moonshine. Then we'll go and hunt up this fellow Sanders, and make it an object for him to forget he ever gave an option to somebody else, and buy him out. Come along, then. We've got torches which, when lighted, will show us the way through the darkness." The 2 schemers walked over to the opening in the rock and entered the crevice. They were out of sight for perhaps an hour, and when they emerged into the light of day once more, it was apparent their quest had been satisfactory, for their eyes burned with an eager glow. "I hope you're satisfied," said Otis Clymer triumphantly. "Satisfied?" exclaimed Plunkett. "Well, I guess I am more'n satisfied. That there mine is a mint for us 2. I'm with you hand and glove from this minute. But it must be halves, share and share alike, do you understand?" "But you agreed to take a third in the first place," protested Clymer half angrily. "The risk of getting those papers has all been mine. I ought to have the larger share." "Can't help that," replied Plunkett doggedly. "You can't do nothing without money, and I've got the dust. I've made up my mind to be an equal partner, and so halves it's got to be." "But I hold the option on the ground," insisted Otis. "Pooh! What good is that to you? It ain't in your name. And if it was, you haven't the money to complete the deal. What you want to do with that option is to destroy it. Then it won't turn up to put us in a hole, maybe. I'm going to look up Jim Sanders right away. If he's the soak you say he is, I shan't have much trouble in getting a bill of sale for that hill out of him. Now, let's settle the thing right here. Are we even partners or we not?" "You've got me where the shoe pinches, so I have to agree," said Clymer reluctantly. "Now you're talking sensibly. I never like to go into a deal where the other man has the bulge on me. I'm treating you perfectly fair, for money counts every time, and it'll take money to put this thing through. You don't know what trouble we may be up against if that fellow Prawl turns up out here and makes a squeal. Without me at your back, you'd be lost. Now that we're equal partners in the enterprise, I'll see you out of it the same as myself, no matter what the consequences happen to be. So shake hands on it." Otis Clymer saw that Plunkett really was master of the situation, and he had sense enough to understand that he couldn't do a thing without his companion's backing. So he held out his hand in an apparently cordial way, and a compact between the 2 was sealed then and there. Plunkett produced a big flat bottle from one of his hip pockets, and they both drank success to the scheme in which they were embarked. Then they took the back track, which brought them to a trail a mile distant, and the trail landed them in Rocky Gulch in the course of an hour. The Gulch was a settlement of perhaps 300 inhabitants. It was not greatly different from some hundreds of other mining camps which have from time to time sprung up in the western wilderness in the night, flourished for a brief time, and then disappeared as the occasion for their existence passed away. It had its stores, saloons, assay offices, so-called hotels, and all the business establishments that characterized such places. It was picturesque and novel in its way, though life here was perhaps a sterner reality than in more civilized communities. Many of the buildings were constructed of wood brought from Trinity, but by far the majority were of canvas, being both cheaper and more readily moved. The stores, saloons, and hotels were ranged side by side along what might be considered the main thoroughfare, while the canvas dwellings were pitched here and there irregularly. The majority of the men at Rocky Gulch were industrious miners, but, as might be expected, there were not a few disreputable characters also, gamblers, whiskey sellers, and loafers, who lived on the sweat of other men's brows. Though Trinity, the river town, was not far away, Rocky Gulch had found it necessary to elect a vigilance committee to preserve a semblance of order, and this committee had a reprising effect on the lawless element. Many dangerous and worthless characters had been run out of the camp time and again, but for all that the inhabitants with one accord always went about armed, for no one could say when he might be up against trouble. When Otis Clymer and Dave Plunkett came over from Trinity that morning to look up the copper mine, they first put up at the Rocky Gulch Hotel. This establishment, the most pretentious, by the way, in the place, consisted of 3 good-sized rooms constructed of timber. The front room, facing the street, was occupied by a small office and a big bar. The middle apartment is a kitchen and dining room, while the rear room was lined with rough bunks without bedding of any kind for the guests to spread their own blankets and sleep as best they could. It was dinner time when the 2 schemers got back to Rocky Gulch, and after that meal they lost no time striking up acquaintance with many of the habitués with the view of finding out the present whereabouts of Jim Sanders. But not one whom they accosted could say where Sanders might be found, though the general opinion seemed to be that Jim was blind drunk somewhere in Trinity. He had disappeared from Rocky Gulch on the day he had received the $100 from Gideon Prawl and given that individual the option on his property. That was all Clymer and Plunkett could learn, and they were grievously disappointed. They were extremely anxious to settle up the business right away, lest Prawl appear on the scene and cause trouble. "I don't see but we must go back to Trinity," said Clymer. "The man doesn't seem to be here." And so to Trinity they returned and began a search for Sanders there. End of chapter 7.